we've been running an exhibit on the Sioux City and the Pacific War out in the hallway, and this was instigated by a donation late last year. We received the uniform from the family of Ted Carlson, who grew up here in Sioux City and went to Central High, and he served in the U.S. Marine Corps, and he ended up serving on Iwo Jima in early 1945, one of the big, more difficult battles of World War II, and it kind of we hadn't done a military exhibit for a while, and so it seemed like a good time to do that, and we decided to focus on the Pacific War component of World War II. World War II is such a huge topic. We thought it would be a good to focus in on one part of it since we received that donation. It turned out in our collection we had all kinds of things relating to Sioux City area people's service in the Pacific War during World War II. So, and including all of the various branches of the U.S. military. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. And let's start off with how World War II started. So first off, the U.S. didn't get involved in World War II right away. World War II began in Europe in September of 1939 when Germany and the Soviet Union invaded Poland at the same time. And then that caused France and Great Britain to declare war on Germany. But a lot didn't happen then until the summer of 1940 when Germany turned around and attacked France. And ended up conquering France by the end of June 1940. And at this point, the U.S. is still staying out of the war. The U.S. really kind of regretted its participation in World War I and how things had turned out. And so there was a strong desire in the United States to stay out of European wars. There was a big faction in the United States that was strongly isolationist in Congress, and there was a desire to stay out of that. But after France fell, that was pretty shocking, and that kind of started the ball rolling. The Franklin Roosevelt administration was more worried about what was going on than probably the average American, and what it could mean for the future if Germany were to take control of the European peninsula. And so there were gradual steps to the U.S. entrance to World War II, but as we'll see, it didn't come from Europe, though. It eventually came from Japan in the Pacific region. But I have listed here a few ways that there was a buildup of U.S. military preparation before the entrance into World War II. One of the things I'll point out is in September of 1940, the U.S. Congress passed the first peacetime draft bill in U.S. history. So it was the first time that men of 18 years of age or older were drafted into military service. And so this is before we were formally at war, but this was a desire to build up the U.S. Military footprint, because at this time, the U.S. maintained a very small standing military. I believe the whole U.S. military was, well, at least the U.S. Army was around 150,000 personnel. So we're talking a pretty small military compared to the more than around 2 million that are in the service today, or around that amount. So it was a much smaller military at that time, and so there was this need to build up. And then really probably the biggest thing before the U.S. actually entered the war that was helpful to the fight against Germany was the passage of the Lend-Lease Act. And Lend-Lease was basically military aid to Great Britain and eventually to the Soviet Union to help them in their efforts against Germany. And so another big step occurred in 1941 when Germany kind of unexpectedly attacked the Soviet Union in June of 1941. So then at that point, the Lend-Lease aid was extended to them, because things were looking like Germany was going to take over the European peninsula. Now, I have some pictures from here in Sioux City on how these things had an impact here in Sioux City. This is a picture from October of 1939, so only about a month after the war began in Poland. There was a recruiting party came up to Sioux City from Fort Des Moines to try to get people in the Sioux City area to enter military service. And so I have listed the young men in the front row, and one I want to point out is Edward Meents, who was the first one on the left. And he ended up going into the U.S. Army Air Corps. And in 1944, he was killed when his bomber, his B-24 bomber, was returning over the English Channel from a mission over Germany, and was killed during his service. And so he's the one of those men that did not come back home. Now, the other thing that happened is the local National Guard was eventually called into active service, and this was in February of 1941. And so the local Army National Guard was the 133rd Infantry Regiment, and so the various companies from Sioux City and the cities surrounding it reported to Sioux City. And the big group picture you have here where the guys are checking out a rifle, that's over at the old Sioux City Armory building at 9th and Pearl Streets, which is the Boys and Girls Club today. And so that's where they're at. And then the other person you see there is General Gordon Holler, who was a longtime member of Sioux City City Council in the 1920s and 1930s. And he had been in I believe he joined the Iowa National Guard back in like 1907. And he ended up being the highest ranking military person from Sioux City during World War II. And in fact, he was the provost marshal, so he was in charge of the military police in the European theater during World War II. And here's a big picture of the 133rd Infantry guys leaving Sioux City at the Milwaukee Depot. So this big crowd is down where Famous Dave's is today in that area by the railroad tracks. And they were going off to Camp Claiborne in Louisiana to do their training. And so their families are seeing them off in this photo. Now, you might say, well, all this started in Europe. How does Japan get involved in this? And it really was a gradual buildup in the Pacific theater as well that was going on, and not necessarily that closely linked to what was going on with Germany. But the U.S. in many ways was more concerned with what Japan had been doing in the 1930s than they were with what was going on in Europe. And so, first off, Japan had been steadily building up its empire since beginning in 1931 when Japan invaded the northern province of Manchuria in China. And so in a lot of ways, Japan was at war with China from 1931 on, and for sure after 1937. So Japan was heavily involved in trying to conquer territory on the Chinese mainland. And at the same time, there was this gradual pushing out onto the islands of the Pacific that Japan had done. For instance, they had taken over some of the Caroline Islands and the Marshall Islands and such that had been German colonial possessions before World War I, and Japan had received those after World War I. And keep in mind, the U.S., it had its own footprint out in the Pacific. Beginning in the late 1800s, the U.S. had made Hawaii a naval base. It had made the island of Guam a naval base. And after the Spanish-American War in 1898, the Philippines had become a U.S. colony. And so the U.S. had this big footprint in Asia, had strong economic and military interest in that area. And so Japan expanding out was very worrisome to officials in the United States. And so as Japan was doing some of these things, particularly the war with China, the U.S. gradually ratcheted up pressure on Japan. And beginning in July of 1940, when some exports of things like airplanes and just obvious things that could be used for military purposes were cut off. And then the U.S. first, then in April 1941, extended Lend-Lease aid to China. And then really the big thing that kind of brought things to head between the United States and Japan was when the U.S. Halted exports of oil and gasoline to Japan. And this is the big thing with Japan. Japan is a country that has very few natural resources on its home islands. But since the late 1800s, Japan had developed into a major industrial power, and it depended on the flow of oil from Indonesia and other areas and from the United States to generate power for its industry. And so that was very much a security issue for Japan, and that they were very concerned about. So in Japan itself, there had been kind of a buildup of militarism in the Japanese government, where the military gradually kind of ousted the civilian leaders. And in October of 1941, General Hideki Tojo became prime minister. And at that point, really, the Japanese military was in charge of the government in Japan. Now, ostensibly, Japan was headed by Emperor Hirohito, but Hirohito, in many ways, was a ceremonial figure. He carried a lot of moral authority, but the major decisions were made by really by the military from 1941 on. Now, basically what the Japanese were weighing their options. And with the U.S. putting pressure on them by cutting off the supply of oil, Japan kind of faced a situation where they could be gradually strangled by the U.S. in economic terms. And so there was a strong bloc, which included Tojo, that put forth the argument that it was better for Japan to strike the U.S. early and try to just basically kowtow the U.S. If they could get one big strike on the U.S. naval fleet in the Pacific, they could possibly force the U.S. to the negotiating table and basically have the U.S. recognize how the Japanese empire had expanded during the 1930s and early 1940s. And so that was what really was behind the decision to attack Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. So here we have an aerial view of Pearl Harbor, and you can see there's kind of an island right in the middle that has an airstrip, and then you can see the various large capital ships of the U.S. Navy there, including aircraft carriers and battleships. Now, here's a picture from actually during the Pearl Harbor attack on December 7th. So it started at 7:48 in the morning on a Sunday, which, the U.S. personnel were caught completely unaware, really. And so it was just a heavy air raid and so this was another thing that was a big change in the history of warfare. This was, the attack on Pearl Harbor was from planes that had been launched from aircraft carriers. And this is something that had developed between World War I and World War II, and would really characterize the war in the Pacific is that a lot of the warfare was based on the aircraft carrier and then on the airplane. And so that's just exactly what happened. Japanese carriers launched several hundred planes toward Pearl Harbor, and they caught the U.S. Navy completely unawares and inflicted very heavy damage and casualties. And there were 4 people from the immediate Sioux City area that were killed in the Pearl Harbor attack, although there was recently another one from northwest Iowa that has just recently been identified. So a 5th person from our area, but I don't have that in the program yet. I'll have to add him. But one of the ships, the U.S. ships that was badly damaged in the Pearl Harbor attack was the USS West Virginia, and one of the men on board was George O'Hara Branham, from Sioux City, and he was killed in that attack. And we have a picture here. You see him in the inset, and then his wife and 4-month-old daughter, unfortunately, lost him in the attack. Now, the West Virginia, even though it was badly damaged, it was actually sunk, but the U.S. Navy was able to raise the West Virginia, and it actually went back into service in 1944, amazingly. Now, one of the really bad casualties was the USS Oklahoma, and in this picture, you could see it on its size. It was actually capsized, and 429 U.S. sailors were killed when it did that. 2 of them were from the Sioux City area, Harry Nichols and Wesley Brown. So they were casualties of that. And then, of course, the big casualty of Pearl Harbor was the USS Arizona battleship. And in this case, the Arizona was completely destroyed because a Japanese bomb really fell into the main magazine of the USS Arizona and exploded. And so 1,177 sailors were killed in that, including Kenneth Bosley from Sioux City was one of the, and of course the Arizona is a great memorial to this day and was completely destroyed. Now, in all, the Pearl Harbor attack, it only lasted 90 minutes, but it was just devastating to U.S. forces in the Pacific. Over 2,400 men were killed, another 1,100, almost 1,200 wounded. There were over 150 aircraft destroyed. And then 4 battleships were either sunk or damaged, and then another 4 damaged, and 2 of them were a total loss, the Oklahoma and the Arizona. But the big thing that saved the U.S. Navy was that all the aircraft carriers were out of Pearl Harbor that day. And in the end, that ended up being the saving grace, because it wasn't really known, but the age of the battleship had passed after World War I and in the intervening years. And it was really the aircraft carrier that was the capital ship of World War II. And because those aircraft carriers weren't in port, the Navy was able to respond very quickly against the Japanese Navy. And if they hadn't been, it would have been much more difficult for the U.S. to mount a response to that attack. So the attack on Pearl Harbor finally brought the United States into World War II, and here we have a picture of President Roosevelt signing the Declaration of War. Both the U.S. and the United Kingdom declared war on Japan on the 8th of December, and then Germany and Italy, for really unknown reasons, turned around and declared war on the U.S. on December 11th. And so for Germany, there was no real reason to do that. They ostensibly had an alliance with Japan, but they really didn't have a strong plan to work together or anything. But pretty quickly after the U.S. entered the war, the United States, the UK, and the Soviet Union decided that Germany was the number one enemy, even though Japan had attacked the United States. And so the U.S. would fight Germany and Japan at the same time, but it was really the U.S. that would carry the burden of the war against Japan, where it shared the burden of the war against Germany with the Soviet Union, and particularly the Soviet Union, and then the British. Now, while the U.S. was preparing to get involved and respond to the Japanese attack, Japan was able to gobble up all kinds of possessions in the Pacific Ocean and into Southeast and South Asia while this was happening. Now, here we have a picture of back in Sioux City on the December of Pearl Harbor, and this is on 4th Street, right outside our building, looking to the west between Nebraska Street and Jackson Street. And so, at that time, what you're seeing as you look back to the west, on the corner of 4th and Nebraska, you have the Toy National Bank and the old Weather Wax men's clothing store, and then where our building was the T.S. Martin department store, and so that's what we're looking at there with the Christmas decorations. Now, in Sioux City, the biggest military outpost was the Sioux City Army Airbase, and I have a little advertisement here. The Sioux City Municipal Airport had just opened in 1940. It had been a Works Progress Administration project at the end of the 1930s, and it was just a little tiny airport, just enough to service, be kind of a beginning start for the U.S. to have, or for Sioux City to have flying service. But right after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Army came in and took over the U.S. airport, or the Sioux City airport, and then another 1,200 acres, and made it a huge bomber training facility. And so the Sioux City Army Air Base, then throughout World War II, was a major training center for crews that flew first the B-24 Liberator bomber, and then the B-17 Flying Fortress bomber. And so at any one time, there were about 6,000 personnel down at the Sioux City Air Base training. For some that did serve in the Pacific, most of the guys that trained here in Sioux City ended up going over to Europe. Now, here we have a picture during the war of the air base, and so we're looking to the west over Sergeant Bluff toward where the airport is today. And so you can see Sergeant Bluff was just a little tiny town at that time, and the original airport was just a little tiny part of this. And so just in months, with the emergency of the war, the Army was able to build all kinds of barracks and other buildings, and then expand the runways to accommodate these big planes that trained here in Sioux City. This is one of my favorite pictures down at the Airbase. You can tell it's during the winter. It looks like it's pretty cold. And there's a guy on the weather tower here climbing up to check things out. And you can see the planes on the tarmac and all the activity that was going on. Now, as I said before, the first trainees were trained in the B-24 Liberator bomber, and that was one of the major aircraft the U.S. used during World War II. It was fairly heavily used in the Pacific theater, and it was actually preferred in the Pacific theater because distances were greater in the Pacific, and the Liberator had a longer flight range than the B-17 Flying Fortress. But crews, especially in Europe, tended to prefer the B-17 because it could fly at a higher altitude. I believe the B-24 was limited to about a 30,000-foot altitude, where the B-17 could fly over 35,000 feet. And so, of course, the higher you could fly, the safer you were from anti-aircraft fire and things like that. After the first year or so, the Sioux City Army Air Base really switched to the B-17 bomber. And so the B-17 then kind of was the main aircraft down at the air base. And so, like I said before, because of the B-17's range limitations, most of the crews that trained here in Sioux City ended up in the European theater as opposed to the Pacific theater. Now, with all this activity going on in Sioux City, there were inevitably accidents. Here's a B-17 that had crashed in a cornfield somewhere around Sioux City, and this happened fairly often. Of course, a lot of the training. Sioux City was the last stage of training, and so it was kind of the most advanced training that the crews received, and they had to do things like fly at night and do these long-range bombing missions, training bombing missions. During the nighttime, and inevitably there were mechanical failures and things like that, and so things would happen, and sometimes with tragic consequences. And in 1944, a B-17 crashed out on Judd Street, out on Sioux City's west side, and as you can see, the plane happened to go right between two houses, and all of the crewmen were killed in this crash, which oftentimes was the case. When these crashes happened, they were fairly rare. But when they happened, they were pretty devastating. But somehow, through some miracle, no one was killed on the ground, no one in either of these houses, which is a pretty remarkable thing. And there were other crashes around here. There was another crash of a B-17 out at Morningside as well. At a certain point, not only were military personnel at the airbase, but civilians gradually were employed at the airbase as well because of just the need for manpower. And so here are a bunch of young women that were brought in to do things like the clerical work that had to go on at a big facility like that. And so they're all taking their picture next to a B-17. Well, now let's get back to the war at a greater scope. And so on this map, we just have kind of the way that the Japanese empire expanded in late 1941, early 1942, and you can see that by this red line that goes all the way around. And so Japan really had taken control of East and South Asia at this point. They had pushed all the way into Burma and nearly to India. They were threatening India. And of course, on the south part, they were very close pushing down on Australia. There was a real fear that there'd be an invasion of Australia. And of course, they were pressing to the east too, and threatening Hawaii with being taken over. And so there were two major naval battles that were really key in May and June of 1941 or 1942. And the first one, I have them circled here. Well, before we get to that, let's talk about our people we have that are leading the charge. So in the Pacific Theater, basically the leadership was placed in Admiral Chester Nimitz and in General Douglas MacArthur. So they were the two main figures, and in most ways MacArthur was the ranking military figure in the Pacific Theater. He had been on the Philippines when the Japanese took control of the Philippines in 1940, early 1942, and so he was the one that kind of controlled the ground forces in the Pacific Theater, and then Nimitz was in charge of the naval operations. So the first big naval battle and kind of the first response the U.S. military had after Pearl Harbor was called the Battle of the Coral Sea. And as you saw on the map, the Battle of the Coral Sea took place kind of off the north, it'd be the northeast coast of Australia. And it was really key because it halted Japan's expansion to the south. It was really kind of a draw, but it was not a loss for the U.S. Navy. And so at that point, the Japanese never really threatened Australia to a great degree after that. Now, this was the first naval battle in which the two naval forces never saw each other. They launched aircraft from beyond line of sight, and it was the aircraft that made war on the opposing ships. And so this wasn't a battle of battleships. It was very much a battle of aircraft carriers. So that was one of the strange things about it. One of the casualties was Craig Strosdas, who was from Sioux City and was on the oiler Neosho, which was sunk during the battle. And as I said, both sides lost about the same amount of ships and the same amount of sailors, but it was basically a draw, and that was as good as a win for the United States in this case. And then the second, really the big thing that halted Japanese expansion was the Battle of Midway in June of 1942. And the Battle of Midway, I'm sure most of you have either watched the movie or movies or have heard another time. It was really kind of an accidental thing. The U.S. Navy was searching for the Japanese fleet, and a group of reconnaissance and dive bombers, reconnaissance planes and dive bombers just came upon it when they were about ready to give up in their search, and they came up on the heart of the Japanese fleet, and the U.S. forces were able to just swoop down and just inflict heavy casualties on the Japanese Navy, and it stunned the Japanese when that happened, and it was really in a lot of ways just good fortune. One of the Sioux City people that participated in this was Willard Woodbury, who was on the crew of a B-17 Flying Fortress, but was stationed at Midway Island and participated in the battle. So it was really Midway that was kind of the I wouldn't say the turning point in the Pacific War, but it was the first time the U.S. really stone cold stopped the Japanese and their expansion. Now, here we have a map, and we won't go through all these, but this is what Nimitz and MacArthur basically came up with was a strategy to kind of fight the Japanese one island at a time in the Pacific. So the Japanese were heavily engaged on the Chinese mainland with China, where they'd been fighting China since 1937, and they had pushed into what today is Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and into Burma, and so the British were engaged in helping the people of Burma fight the Japanese there, and so the Japanese were pretty heavily engaged on the mainland, but they had forces on all these little islands of the Pacific, and Nimitz and MacArthur thought it was a good idea to just take one island at a time and expel them that way instead of trying to mount some kind of big frontal assault. And so it was called island hopping in a kind of a colloquial term. And so that's exactly what they happened. So there were two main drives. One was up through the Solomon Islands in New Guinea up toward the Philippines, and another was in the Central Pacific through the Carolines and the Marshall Islands and the Marianas and toward Japan itself. And so those were kind of the two ways that the Pacific theater worked during World War II. Now, the first big land battle in the Pacific theater was at Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, which is down just off the east coast of Australia. And this, as would be the case in almost all of the Pacific engagements, it was the U.S. Marines that would be landed initially on these islands by the U.S. Navy, and then they would have to confront Japanese forces, which sometimes were 10 or 20,000 Japanese might be on these small islands, and so each one was just a brutal campaign. And then the U.S. Army was also involved, and in certain, especially in the larger islands, would be brought in to also also helped the Marines. But it was really, the Pacific Theater was largely a operation of the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Marine Corps, in many ways carried it out. So at Guadalcanal, the Marines were able to land fairly easily on the island. But as you can see in the second photo, Guadalcanal was a tropical environment, and this is in many ways one of the first times the U.S. Army or the U.S. Marines and Army had ever fought this kind of warfare. And so it was just a very difficult jungle battle on Guadalcanal that raged from August 1942 until February 1943. And a Sioux City young man, Harry Fulton, served in the Marines as a Marine Corps private on Guadalcanal. And this is one of the great things about this is for all the major engagements of the Pacific War, somebody from Sioux City participated in it. And that just astonishes me that a Sioux City, a town of 80,000 people, that's how impactful this event was on people just in one particular spot in the United States. Well, then the next big campaign after Guadalcanal was Bougainville in the Solomon Islands, and Bougainville was much more difficult than Guadalcanal. It was bigger, and it was more heavily defended by the Japanese. And the U.S. forces fought there for an entire year, and then after that, the U.S. forces moved on and were making their way toward the Philippines, and the Australians took over and fought the Japanese on Bougainville until the very end of the war in August of 1945. So this was a very difficult campaign. Here you see U.S. Marines being loaded onto Navy landing boats to be landed on Bougainville. One of the guys from Sioux City that served on Bougainville was Alvern Moscow, and he was a Sioux City fireman who went into the Marines in 1941 after Pearl Harbor, in early 1942 after Pearl Harbor, and was I believe 26 years old when he went in, so he was a little bit on the older side for guys that signed up for Marine Corps duty, and he ended up serving on Bougainville, on Guam, and on Iwo Jima. So he had quite an experience during World War II. And so you can see in Bougainville they even landed tanks and such to fight the Japanese there. Again, another tropical environment, just a very difficult place to fight. Now, the first Bougainville and Guadalcanal had gone fairly well as far as the landings. It was then later the fighting as they pushed inland that was very difficult. The one that really changed the Japanese strategy was Tarawa. And in Tarawa, the Japanese, first off, this was the first major battle of that central Pacific area. So this was the drive up toward the Japanese home islands itself. And on Tarawa, the Japanese mounted a heavy defense of the beaches. And so when the Marines were landed on the beaches, they were met immediately with heavy fire of machine guns and artillery. And so it was hard just to get off the beach. And this, I immediately think of the opening scenes of Saving Private Ryan on the D-Day invasions. And that's kind of what these all were. They were all smaller versions of the D-Day invasion. And in many ways, the U.S. military got its training in doing those kinds of amphibious landings in the Pacific in 1942, 1943, early 1944. One of the Sioux City guys that was on Tarawa was Jack Garthright, and he was wounded serving in the Marine Corps. And so on the one picture, you see the Marines stuck on the beach, trying to get off the beach without very much cover in order to get off of there. And so after Tarawa, there was a policy was changed where the U.S. would, when they made these landings, would try to have at least 6 times the estimated force of the Japanese, so they could just overwhelm on the beaches, and then that would only come after a month of naval bombardment of the landing area. So Tarawa forced a major change in how the U.S. was going about this. And now we get to Saipan, and Saipan was the next step after Tarawa, and it was maybe one of the more brutal ones in the early part of this campaign. Well, it was in the mid part of this campaign in June and July of 1944. And on Saipan, the Japanese just fought to literally the last man to hold the island of Saipan. And one of the casualties of those killed was Rene Yaki, of a U.S. Marine Corps private from Sioux City. And the U.S. Army was heavily involved on Saipan, but losing Saipan was such a disastrous defeat for the Japanese. First off, the commanding general on Saipan, Yoshitsugu Sieitao, committed suicide after this. I remember one of our guests here today. Her father, I believe, was involved in the Saipan offensive, and it also was so devastating that Prime Minister Tojo stepped down. So that this was a major strategic defeat for the Japanese. Now, after Saipan, there was another major naval battle, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, in June of 1944. And this was Japan's way of trying to take pressure off these various outposts that they had in their Pacific Empire. And so in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, this was just a disaster for the Japanese Navy. The U.S. Navy really turned the tables on Japan in that engagement. And you can see by the losses that there was only one battleship that sustained damage and 109 sailors killed on the U.S. side, but Japan lost 3 aircraft carriers and over 3,000 sailors, and so it was a very lopsided loss for Japan. One of the Sioux City people that participated in the Battle of the Philippine Sea was Earl Chauncey, who served both in the Battle of the Philippine Sea and then later at Leyte Gulf in the Philippine Islands. Now, the next stage that really foreshadowed the retaking of the Philippines and also the final push to Japan was the battle in Peleliu in the Palau Islands. Peleliu is one of the more controversial engagements in the Pacific War during World War II, because a lot of military thinkers, even at the time, didn't necessarily think it was necessary. But when the planning was going on to retake the Philippines, it was worried that these islands would be a problem for basically the right flank of the U.S. forces going into the Philippines, and so they were taken at great cost. And so you can see in the one photo the U.S. landing craft going toward the island of Peleliu. And again, this much like on Tarawa, they were met immediately with fierce resistance by the Japanese. And then in this island, it had a lot of caves and mountainous terrain, and the Japanese were really dug in tight, and so they literally had to just go foot by foot and try to drive out the defenders of the island. And it was a U.S. victory, but at a very high cost. And my grandfather was involved in this. He drove one of the landing craft for the U.S. Navy, and he said it was by far the worst thing that he experienced. And just the landing itself was terrible, let alone being one of the Marines going in ashore and fighting their way ashore. One of the Sioux City people involved in the landing at Peleliu was Robert Morgan, a U.S. Marine Corps private who was wounded, and he had also served at Guadalcanal and on New Guinea, so he had heavy experience in the Pacific theater. Now, the big kind of the beginning of the end for the Pacific War was the reinvasion of the Philippines. And of course, we have one of the most famous photos in American military history, General MacArthur wading back to shore on the island of Leyte, just one of the outer islands of the Philippine archipelago. And of course, he had famously said, "I shall return," when he left the Philippines a couple of years earlier. And so, and the Battle of Leyte, another very difficult campaign, and actually the Philippines campaign went on then until the very end of the war. It was a very brutal campaign. Luckily the native Philippine army was a well-trained force and was heavily involved in helping push back the Japanese as well in the Philippines. One of the Sioux City guys that served on Leyte was Lowell Miller, a U.S. Army sergeant, and he was killed during the campaign on Leyte. Now, well, it wasn't the last naval battle in the Pacific Theater, but the last great battle of the Pacific Theater was almost simultaneous to the retaking of the Philippines, and that was the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October of 1944. And by most estimates, this is the greatest naval battle in history. And it was really the last time the Japanese were able to mount a full-fledged offensive, but it was such a defeat for Japan that they were no longer able, after the Battle of Leyte Gulf, they were no longer able to mount carrier-based exercises from that point on. And it was actually at this point then that the famous kamikaze strategy of the suicide diving into ships began, and continued for the rest of the war. And one of the Sioux City residents that served at the Battle of Leyte Gulf was Gerard Thibodeau, and he served on the battleship USS Washington, and earned 12 battle stars in all of the various engagements that the Washington had during the war. Now we get to kind of the final push toward Japan, and first with the landing on the island of Iwo Jima. And Iwo Jima was really just another step up from the experience from what had happened on Peleliu. But on Iwo Jima, first off, this was the first invasion into what could be considered the periphery of the Japanese home islands. And so the Japanese forces just fought for every single inch of and as you can see, I don't have a picture here, but out in the exhibit, if you look, Iwo Jima is just a little tiny rock out in the middle of the ocean, and nobody lived on it before World War II, and it was that strategically important, and so it was just a brutal campaign. And of course, you had the famous raising of the U.S. flag on Mount Suribachi. In the early, the campaign was by no means, it went on until the end of March, but that became a famous image for U.S. forces in the Pacific War, and helped raise funds for the U.S. military effort. And this is where Theodore Carlson comes in. And so Theodore Carlson was only 17 years old. He had had enlisted in the U.S. Marines and ended up on Iwo Jima at 17, and probably didn't figure that was going to happen, I imagine. And what an experience for somebody at that age. And I found it interesting. I'm sure there were more Sioux City people on Iwo Jima, but Carlson was there, and so was Al Moscow. And they were kind of on either side of it, where Carlson was at the young end, and Moscow was kind of on the older end at that point. And so just very, very interesting just coincidence. Well, Iwo Jima set the stage then for what was the greatest land battle of the Pacific War, and that was Okinawa. And Okinawa is a much larger island, closer to Japan. It is actually more of it wasn't one of the Japanese home islands, but it was heavily populated. There were many, tens of thousands of Japanese lived on Okinawa, and so being bigger, it was more heavily defended by both Japanese military personnel and civilians. And so it was the largest and bloodiest battle of the war. And initially the landings went pretty well, and there was part of the island was taken, and then the defense began, and it was just a long, hard slog that went from April to the end of June 1945. And it was really the experience on Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa that convinced U.S. military planners that invading the Japanese island was going to be unthinkably terrible. If you just kind of do the math, it was bound to be a very brutal campaign. And so the initial idea was that the Soviet Union, after the Germans were defeated, which happened in May of 1945, the Soviets agreed that they would invade Japan from the north, and then the Americans and the British were going to invade from the south, and that was kind of the idea. But no one knew about the Manhattan Project and the development of the atomic bomb, which ended up changing the whole situation in the Pacific Theater. And one of the casualties on Okinawa from Sioux City was Paul Halderman, who was an Army private that was killed in the fighting. And the last big naval battle of the Pacific War was the Battle of the East China Sea, which took place off of Okinawa, between Okinawa and the Japanese home islands. And this was really this was the battle where the kamikaze tactics were the most devastating. You can see a picture of a kamikaze plane flying into the USS Bunker Hill on your right that killed 396 people. But at this point, the Japanese basically had almost none of their carrier force, and so they were limited to battleships, and it was just a resounding defeat for the Japanese Navy. It was really a desperate act. And one of the Sioux City people that served in the Battle of the East China Sea was Gordon Woolridge, who was on the destroyer, the USS Longshore, and he earned 9 battle stars serving on that ship during the war. Now, at this point, then, the U.S. leaders are thinking about how they're going to go about securing Japan's final defeat. And the plan was to continue strategic bombing of the Japanese home islands and eventually having to invade. And so the big new piece of technology that was brought into the effort was the B-29 Superfortress bomber, which had gone into action in June of 1944. And so this is well before the atomic bomb. The B-29s were used to conventionally bomb the Japanese home islands. And from June 1944 on, Japan was being bombed by these B-29s. And this happens to be a picture of some B-29s at the, sorry about this, I'm not sure why we got this going on, but these B-29s, they brought them to the Sioux City Armory Airbase on August 2nd, 1945, the picture that you see. So just 4 days before the bombing of Hiroshima, the first atomic bomb. And the idea was the U.S. Army, or the U.S. The Army Air Base here in Sioux City was going to start training crews in the B-29 Superfortress, and so they were going to convert over. In the end, that didn't end up happening, but they had already landed some B-29s here at that point. And one of the Sioux City people that was heavily involved in the bombing of Japan was Lloyd Hovland, who was a flight engineer on a B-29, and he flew 27 combat missions over Japan in 1944 and 1945. Well, finally, so when the Manhattan Project had been going on since pretty early in the war, the development of the atomic bomb, but remember, President Roosevelt had died in April of 1945, and when Vice President Harry Truman took over, he didn't even know about the Manhattan Project. It was so secret. But he came, there was a successful test in July of 1945 down in New Mexico, and Truman authorized using the atomic bomb against Japan to try to force a quick ending to the war. And so Hiroshima, the city of Hiroshima was chosen as the first target, and on August 6th, the first atomic bomb was dropped. And these had been launched from the island of Tinian, which had been one of the islands taken earlier in the Pacific campaign. And sorry about this. And so the first atomic bomb killed over 100,000 people fairly quickly. Now, do keep in mind the conventional bombing of Tokyo earlier in the year had killed about the same number of people. So, but it was just with one bomb instead of hundreds or thousands of bombs that did this. But Japan refused to surrender after Hiroshima, and so then on August 9th, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, and initially, it was supposed to be dropped on the city of Kokura, but the weather prevented it, and so the secondary target was Nagasaki, and again, another 50 to 60,000 people were killed fairly instantly. And in this case, because of the course was changed, the B-29 that dropped that almost didn't make it back to base because it was running out of fuel. You could see by the flight path, they had to make an emergency landing on Okinawa to refuel so that they could get back to Tinian. But the second bomb really did the trick, and Japan agreed to surrender. Really, only though after Emperor Hirohito said that they had to surrender. So it was really the emperor coming forward and saying we have to, give up the fight. That then the war came to an end in the Pacific Theater. And so with that, we had the end of the war overall, and there was a big victory parade in Sioux City on October 15th, 1945. And so this picture's on 4th Street, and we're at Pierce Street looking to the east from Pierce on 4th. And you can see the Boy Scouts are carrying these huge flags that they had displayed over at the Woodbury County Courthouse that had a blue star and a gold star for all the Woodbury County residents that served during World War II in both theaters. And so there were almost 11,000 blue stars and over 350 gold stars for those that had lost their lives. And that's my last slide, but does anyone have any questions for me?